Hello everyone. Today I have a book that I've been reading for quite some time on and off, and I finally sat down to fully just finish it, and it feels really good to do that, and I wanted to share that book with you all here today. It is Mind Control by Peter Schrag. And apparently Peter, there's a picture of him right there, if I can, there we are. So apparently he was born in Europe and moved to America at the age of 10 during 1941. And so he came over as an immigrant. I'm not sure if a refugee exactly, but anyway, he kind of dives into the peak of what we would call the medical drug transformation of the American medical system in the 1970s, where it really kind of hit its peak. And I believe this book is written in 1979 or late 70s, I believe. And I actually picked this up at a book fair once. I picked it up at a book fair, and that's kind of where I kind of got interested in it. And so the subtitle here says, "A shocking account of all the methods being developed and used to control not only what we do, but how we think and feel." So this is the whole kind of, I don't know what you would call it, conspiracy loophole about the government overreach and control. And it kind of shows that since, we're almost 20 plus years since the Patriot Act and that kind of thing, and computers and technology and privacy. But even back then, there was still this mentality of subversion and anti-subversion awareness to the general public. And so I actually thought, mistakenly, this book would be mostly about the MKUltra program. And it does touch on that, but I was surprised that all the conspiratorial, doomsday, doom setting, or however you want to say it, was all very legal, documented things, like, these centers for, like, the American Institute of Psychology, victims claims organization. It's all very real, for lack of a better word. This isn't real. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is conspiracy fact. It's just like, hey, there was this program under Reagan, and the circumvent and went back and forth, and this would happen. So it's all very by the book, but it does paint a picture that is very dystopian. You can only imagine how much it's extrapolated to now. And it really goes in, it's the ages from the 1950s to the 1970s, and the creation of I don't want to call them a drug cartel, but the drug medical industry in America, through the use of pills and synthetics. And so the book does divide the different, how would you call, therapies between strictly, medications, what's the big one? I don't want to say minoxidil. It's Valium. Valium, that's the big one. And then you have other things like electroshock, which, shockingly, is still kind of around. Apparently it's making a resurgence or something. And so it goes into what it was actually used for, how it was actually used to treat patients. And it also kind of, for a lot of the book, it actually breaks down drug use, drug prescriptions, and the connection between government funding and these clinics and doctors and whatever, and its socioeconomic distribution. So, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on, I guess, a class relationship where, the drug use for the poor people on welfare. It mentions things like the Tsukiji, I can't say it correctly, but the event in which welfare class mothers that had syphilis would go in to get it treated, but instead they were actually being sterilized against their knowledge. And so there's a lot of things, and it does another against their knowledge thing was also this one example where The clinics that were dispensing these new kinds of drugs would give people LSD against their will, which is exactly what MKUltra was doing. So it's very interesting to see all of this stuff come into play. Another thing, and there's a few examples. That's what I really like about this book. There's a few, not a few, but there's quite a lot of anecdotes which really help paint a picture. Yes, they're kind of one-off cases, one-off extremes, but it does help paint a picture of the limits and the extent of the situation at the time. For example, one of the most egregious, I think, examples in the book is, and I might pick it out, it was a 37-year-old woman, I believe, who had come in for minor paranoia. Essentially, she was having these, I want to say, visions of Jesus or talking to Jesus or God or something, and she was slightly paranoid about, like, her groceries or something. Anyway, she was just nervous, and she came in, and what they did is they prescribed her a whole list of medications. And this particular scenario, the drug cocktail that the doctors gave her, maybe because it was her or the imbalance or whatever, it was so extreme that in the matter of a week, she had been vegetabilized, i.e. she went from a slightly nervous, paranoid, mid-ish age woman to a quadriplegic, stone-faced, incontinent, and tube-fed individual within a week from these intense drugs. And so that is the outer limit of this horrific shift in the American medical system. That it's like, oh, you have a problem, we'll just medicate it away, even if the medication in turn destroys you. And while the literature isn't direct in this, well, it is semi-direct in this theming. It's funny, like, it's all very factual about, you know, these systems and programs, how much money was spent, which doctors were involved, what they were advocating. There's a famous Dr. Skinner, I'm gonna look it up in a sec. But these, you know, and their philosophy and how it transforms. So, like, one of the major philosophies throughout all of this is the distinction or readjustment of the idea of madness and what is mental illness. And so, for example, madness used to be classified as a state of, how would you say, a state of cause, or a cause of a state, that if someone was mad, you would just send them to the asylum. And it touches a little bit on that era in the 1850s, where asylums were first kind of established. And it's really interesting that there are many doctors, or there was one doctor in particular that kind of, and other doctors agree with him, that essentially said that poverty and mental illness are part and parcel. So it's kind of a weird thing to where we are now, where I remember there was this one kind of political debate where it's like, oh, why can't we just give the homeless people money to buy homes and get jobs and give them opportunities? And the guy shot back, it's like, because homelessness is not an economic issue, it's a mental health issue. And it's funny that I had never heard that. And the second time I'm hearing it is from a book from the 70s. That's kind of crazy how much our cultural lens has shifted over the time. And so what the doctor goes on to say was that essentially the idea of, yeah, like, so poor, yeah, sorry. It's a chicken and an egg scenario where they agree that it's part and parcel, but the other doctors are fighting against the consensus if it's the poverty that causes the mental illness and the stress and whatever, or if it's the mental illness that causes the poverty. And so the main driving point, honestly, that Peter gets into this book is that the lower class, the poor and the underprivileged are the most medicated in the country. They are the most, I wouldn't say targeted, but they come in for an issue or any kind of mental health issue that can be, or any some kind of issue that can be construed as a mental health issue. They are given drugs. They are just pumping out all of this medication. And so, yeah, it's like a massive industry, and I think it's been established like that during this time, and it comes up to this point. I mean, it started in the 50s with housewives being prescribed Valium, and I believe for morning sickness there was thalidomide, which was a German pharmaceutical drug from the 50s, and the result of that, it was allegedly a horrific wide-scale problem that the result of taking thalidomide while pregnant were children born without limbs. And that was, as I'm told, a massive scandal at the time. And just on that note, what I've heard recently is that thalidomide, while not used for morning sickness anymore, is still used in topical applications, i.e. it's used to like rub creams on people for reasons, acne, I'm not actually sure. But they're still around. Like, and this is the growing problem, not to sound like a revolutionary, right? But the American medical institution is definitely more capital than social. I mean, there's capital, there's making money, there's making a good product, and then there's screwing over your customers for the pure sake of profit. I know I've had conversations and arguments with people what is capitalism and what is predatory predatory capitalism or obsessive controlling. I forget the exact words, but yeah, there's a range of, there's good business and bad business, right? And the medical institution in America is just this monolith. I mean, ever since, so from Valium in the 50s to the COVID times of modern day, and the whole generation of, I would say, the 90s was overprescription of ADHD, medications like Ritalin. Like it's a known thing. It's kind of a joke, really, amongst many people. And Ritalin, by the way, it's just it's a methamphetamine. It's a reduced version of meth, of speed. It's kind of like an open secret, and I don't really understand why more people are openly against this, because it's been normalized, I guess. And I'm thinking right now, I know at least a couple people that have been severely harmed from medical intervention, or rather, young girls, honestly, who had, some sort of depression in their late teens, and they come in and the doctor prescribes them something that makes it much, much worse. And I at least know a couple people like that. And I don't know, it's weird we don't really think about it that way. Maybe it's propaganda or advertising that makes us not think this way, but the way this book from the 70s kind of paints a cultural picture of America where you feel this real sense of dread and terror that even the professionals who are prescribing these drugs don't even know what they're doing. And it's this feeling of I believe it was the Miller experiment, where in the 50s you had a person who was in a lab coat, and the experimental person who was brought in, who knew was like being experimented on, or they thought they were, and they were being told to increase voltage on shocking a certain patient. And what they found is that 80 to 90% of people would deliver a lethal electrical shock to the subject if a person in a lab coat, if a person looked and sounded respectable and authoritative, most people would actually follow the instructions and go through with the lethal dosage. And that's kind of what it feels like. It's like we have these doctors and these physicians that we all assume know what they're doing, and really in reality they're doing extreme harm. Because again, it's the psychology of help, right? If you trust someone is helping you, then there's really nothing you won't really do. And aside from funding it, and that's another thing that Peter goes into, is that of the poor class of people who do actually go and partake in the kind of pharmaceutical, legal drug trade, for example, or whatever you say, it essentially accounts, it's 100, that is 100% funded by government programs. It is an institutional mechanism, essentially. And then it goes into the reality of it. And this is really interesting. So it is kind of tearing down the psychological illusion of the medical industry and what they've done. And it's so interesting because these are the assumptions that we carry with ourselves every day. And he really points it out. And so he brings up some conversations between, congressional attorneys questioning doctors, and they're questioning them on what is the definition of a mental illness. And so, yes, is alcoholism a mental illness? And the guy said, well, it could be, because there are people with genetic dispositions. So it could be an actual kind of disease rather than a mental thing. It could be their gut, their liver, or their biome. He said, okay, well, what about schizophrenia? And he said, yes, that is definitely a mental illness. It's like, okay, but what about a personality disorder? And he's like, well, that would be a mental disorder. It's like, okay. And so the line of questioning kind of goes to the point that, they have a medical journal, right? A medical journal of mental illnesses and psychological, things. And the history of it is derived from, it was, I think sometime in the late 1800s, you had the declassification of mental diseases. And so it's interesting, in the mid 1800s you have no, actually I think I might get the order confused, but it's first you had madness, and madness was just a general, this person's crazy, they don't know what's wrong with them. And so that was reevaluated as, okay, in the asylum era, the idea was that, before that, you would just basically exile that person. There's nothing we can do, just put him in someone's basement. And in the 1850s, the idea was that, okay, if someone's crazy, we're going to have a special place for them that's not a prison. It's going to be asylum. And of course, the criticism from that movement is that the asylum was the same, exact same, if not worse than the prison. And so it's no, there it was. But the idea shifted from a cause to a symptom. It's the idea that if someone is crazy, we can do something to fix it. It's the idea that nurture can alter nature, that we have the power and the ability to fix this issue. And so that led to the declassification of hysteria in the early 1900s for, women, and, that is linked, that was my inference, but it's linked probably to hysterectomies, which are the removal of the reproductive organs. And then eventually other things where, I'm probably skipping a lot, but in 1972, homosexuality was, up until that point, considered a mental illness, a mental disease, and that was declassified. And so you see this shift in the 70s where it's okay, not only is the medical institution in America or the West or whatever, not only is it reevaluating the idea that these traditional mental illnesses and mental disorders can be fixed rather than just, say, there's nothing we can do. Not only are they moving more and more towards the idea that they can medicate and fix and try to solve the issue, but also there's an overclassification of what is a mental illness. For example, there's one point taken that, and this is, I think, still true today, I'm not sure, that psychosis, for example, a very common, if not the most common kind of mental disorder or illness, modern scientists or doctors or the field still doesn't know what exactly causes it. It's actually still a mystery. And so here's the issue. Here's the issue where it comes in, is that you have these professionals and these experts who are prescribing solutions for problems they don't even understand. And so it becomes this gray area where, like, okay, are you really taking care of this person, or are you A, making a profit on them, or B, using them as your personal guinea pig? And it's a very scary thought to think about. There's one doctor who's quoted who's like, yeah, my method or my mode is medicate, step 1, and step 2, hope for the best. So yeah, I don't think things have really changed all that much, to be honest. And so the whole point from Congress is that, look, you need to have an audit or an auditable, justifiable trail that justifies the medications you're rolling out to these people. If you're just giving them whatever and in the turn making them worse, like if we don't have a mutual way of knowing that what you are prescribing and giving and doing is actually helping, then how can we trust or respect you? And it's a very fair point, right? And so it's really interesting how the way the doctors said it in the historical context is that first was the declassification of madness and these kind of other mental diseases as causes, but things they can fix. And then apparently there was some era where they integrated with Freudian psychology. And so it's like, oh, there's always a root cause to everything. It didn't actually go into detail on what they meant by Freudian methodology or psychology for this, but it existed and it was used. And then it ended up with the idea that we can just medicate all our problems away. And so, yeah, it goes into this overarching theme of, if someone's really crazy and we're just going to medicate, like, it's like, the idea is like, we're just going to give them sedatives. And I mean, sometimes that does work when someone is crazy because they haven't slept for a while, but then you overprescribe and overdose and you turn someone into basically a zombie. And the scary, not the scary, but the conflicting ideals that really, I think, appear in this book are between dangerous freedom or safe slavery. Do you want to have someone who is slightly, and then becomes a question, well, what is crazy? What actually is someone eccentric? Are they kind of, I mean, if they're destructive or self-destructive, sure, but that might just be a lapse. That might not be their entire nature. It just might be one instance. And so you have to like evaluate and reevaluate that. And then it's like, do we just take all of the chaos of human nature and try to subdue it? And so this is where it gets into the overarching feeling of control, mind control and behavior control. And unfortunately, I think one thing it should have mentioned was like television and propaganda, but it doesn't go into that. It goes into the very strictly documented things that we know about, things like electroshock therapy. So the extremes of electroshock therapy and the benefits of it, I didn't even realize there were benefits, but they did find, apparently there was an Italian doctor who was shocking a patient who had epileptic seizures And so the idea was that there's a mismatch in the electrical impulses to the brain, and the synapses are misfiring, which is why they would have odd movements. And so this Italian doctor kept increasing the voltage, and apparently this is the first time it was done. And this guy was speaking gibberish, and at the point that he was about to increase it even more, the assistants were like, "No, we're not doing this. This is crazy. We could possibly kill him." And as he was about to do it, suddenly the patient started speaking perfect fluent Italian, saying, "Please don't shock me." So there is this apparently long-standing history of electroshock therapy for essentially kind of possessed people. Apparently it goes all the way back to the Romans, or the late Romans apparently. And guess how they did electroshock therapy? It's kind of obvious, but extremely cartoonish. So apparently the way they did it is that they would give electric eels to people and have them hold it. That is just crazy. So there's a long history of this methodology and this idea that you have to shock the demon possession out of some people. Another weird benefit that is a little interesting is they found that electroshock therapy could also reconnect certain pathways in the brain. And so apparently there were some patients that got rather aroused from electroshock therapy. Apparently the implementation of electrical signals to the brain for some people was, identical to arousal, with one extreme example of female patients who came in very normal and, not familiar with any of the staff or the doctor, and saying by the end of the session she wanted to marry him. So do with that information what you will. However, in the more extreme cases, because you want to be careful about this, obviously, in the more extreme case of electroshock therapy, not only to treat epilepsy and other things like that, actually, before I go on, this actually finally makes sense to me as to why the trope of, electroshock therapy for homosexual men made sense, because the concept behind it is that, okay, we're reactivating the libido kind of sensors, and the idea is that, to shock the gay away isn't exactly accurate. It's more like you're shocking in the straight. You're realigning the idea of a normal male-female arousal in a homosexual individual. And then that, of course, shifted into the whole idea of that, okay, there's one doctor who had the thing where he had, he gave a kit, basically, I'm not sure if it's a DIY kit that he sold to, I think he sold to other doctors, not individuals, but it was a kit with electrodes and a slide deck of young to older boys and men who were in homosexually arousing positions and whatever. And so that's where the idea that as you go through the slide deck and then there's a feeling of arousal, as soon as the image pops in, like half a second later, an electrical shock is administered to deter the person from feeling that arousal. So the next time they see or interact or have that emotion, it's a Pavlovian effect that they won't do that anymore. So it's kind of interesting because that's completely counterintuitive to the whole libido reinvigoration idea. They're two completely opposite applications. And so that's why it's kind of considered today a form of quack science, because there's no full consensus on this thing and it's kind of taboo. So I guess it just fell out of favor. And actually goes into that too, that there are certain organizations that by the mid-70s were erected to impede the propagation of these more extreme medical procedures and practices because they were having such negative effects. And so there was, in the very opening of this book, actually, there's a planned facility in somewhere near LA, with like next to like some ex-missile base or something, where they were going to have the Violent Behavior Modification Center, where they were going to study violent behaviors, which was apparently endorsed by Richard Nixon, and it was funded to the tune of $500,000 plus $250 from another organization, and it was completely shut down by a like American Victims Organization of Psychiatric Treatment or something. And so there was a pushback, a major pushback to these methodologies and institutions because they were causing, in some cases, extreme problems. And so, for example, the worst case of electroshock therapy examples that people came across is that in extreme examples of extreme shock, there weren't any instances of death, I think, but there were actually many instances of significant memory loss. And so that is actually, in a way, a lot more alarming. So if the voltage and the duration is high enough, then that individual will lose their memories. And what's crazy to me is that this actually happened to a very famous individual that caused them to commit suicide. And that is Ernest Hemingway, the famous American writer. And he made the note or the statement that you may have cure the disease, but you will lose the patient, for you have robbed me of my mind, which has been my greatest capital. So this is really crazy. If it can happen to someone famous like that, you can just imagine how many other people this was happening to. It's just crazy. So yeah, and then so you have the medical, the electroshock, and the third one is kind of the judicial, the government, and kind of technology a little bit. And so it's really scary because at this point in the 70s, the concept of a computer was around, but it was so rudimentary. And yet Peter was able to predict with a very high degree of, I don't want to say certainty, but it was the right idea, that he was even concerned from the fact that you could have a catalog of a patient and their medical history, and you could have a perfect record of all of their symptoms and whatever, and their associated problems and their associated family and their problems and genetic hereditary stuff, and it can all be stored in a computer. But like the crazy thing, the internet didn't exist, right? But even he was concerned that, he makes the comment, it's so funny, like, of course it's much easier to pick up a file folder full of medical documents and walk away than it is to get it out of the computer. But he said, but I predict, and I can see the function that computers can send information between each other. And he said that I predict that one day we're going to have a collection, a pot of data that will be freely accessible and available, in which the medical privacy of every US citizen will no longer exist, and will only serve the interests of this field that already is kind of abusing its power. And he got into this really interesting point about like the authoritization of truth and the authoritization of science as a cultural concept that will replace individualistic kind of consensus. And he talked specifically about the whole concept of forms, like official forms, where you have something printed out. It's like, okay, you have depression, ADHD, autism, manic depressive disorder, bipolar disorder. And he said the very printing out of this information based on mental illnesses, which may not even be real or credible, lends so much credibility and authority to people who again have like, they're not absolute, but they have the potential to be abusive in their care. And he predicts a dystopian future in which every American is over-prescribed, over-medicated, and out of their minds from people who are self-interested, capital-seeking employees. And it's like, yep, you're getting a gold medal there. I think you got it. He definitely got it, you know. And it's sad and it's weird that, you know, you have these people in the past that predict these dystopian situations, and it's not like we can look at them and say, oh, they were crazy, you know, that's never going to happen, World War III or whatever. But it's kind of like, yeah, that's pretty accurate, unfortunately. And on that point about mental illness not being real, you know, like a lot of these mental illnesses, like you know, like ADHD, like they were invented in like the 80s or 90s. Like a lot of the mental illnesses that we have today, like they were invented in the late 1900s. They didn't exist. And so again, I think I go back to that conversation between the attorney of Congress and the doctor, where he's asking, well, what is a mental illness? Like, how do you even justify it? And so he kind of says, oh, well, any mental pattern that presents itself as aberrant or a kind of cope for someone's specific situation that is abnormal or strange is essentially grounds for something that we can define as a mental illness. And so the conversation essentially ends up at the point where the congressional person says, so what isn't a mental illness? Like, is everything a mental illness then? And so it's that vagueness and that it's the vagueness of the problem combined with the fake authority of the figure, I guess a Freudian model or something, combined with the technological documentation and prowess and the economic incentive from the government and the pharmaceutical industry that creates this scenario where people who have natural reactions to their situations are fixed through non-official, non-real, non-substantial means. And it's like, yeah, so that's kind of the picture he paints, is that, I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, it's just a picture of no one knows what they're doing, and half the people, you know, and the doctors are doing this, but they're also prescribing it to the politicians and the executives and the wealthy families, the middle-class families, the poor families, especially, apparently, who are more disposed to getting prescribed and addicted to. And I think at the time he said it was like 10% of the population was on some kind of constant medication. And it's this idea of the doctors don't even know what a mental illness is, and the entirety of the country is operating in a surreal, abnormal state. And when you paint that into context, plus 30 years, plus, oh my God, almost 50 years now, it makes sense why some people on social media seem crazy, because we literally are. It's very much the elephant in the room kind of scenario. It's like, right. And I was joking with someone, everyone on Twitter, besides their pronoun, should put their medications in their profile, because it would put into context, like, is everyone just mentally ill at this point? Is everyone just medicated and just unable to cope with reality? And what percentage is it? And I think it'd be a pretty horrifying reality that's just hidden from us, because it's so ubiquitous that no one actually wants to know. It's like a sin that everyone's doing, and no one wants to talk about it because it's like, it's not like Dr. Phil or Dr. Oz, rather, like, oh, you should stop eating apricot butter or something. Like, right, there's like 2 people in the United States who have apricot butter. Like, oh yeah, those people, they're apricot butter. But here it's like, you should stop taking SSRIs. It's like, that's like most people. So anyway, I'm going to just read some excerpts from this. There was, I think overall, I haven't talked about the actual reading of the book. I would say the pacing and the wording is usually pretty good. Sometimes it obviously does get pretty dry, but for the most part, there were some things where I couldn't skip through. I actually had to lock in and read it because it was very juicy, all the details. So let me read some excerpts for you guys. It is no longer the cop or the schoolmaster telling the individual what to do. It is science. The individual is no longer being punished, he is being treated. There is no longer a set of impositions which he can regard as unjust or capricious, and against which he can dream of rebelling. To entertain such dreams would be madness. Gradually, even the ability to imagine alternatives begin to fade. This is, after all, not only the best of all possible worlds, it is the only one. In an open society formally committed to due process and civil liberties, the consequences of such conditions are beyond calculation. It also reminds me of not only One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but also this one clip of, and I've always joked about this, about psychiatrists. Like, everyone says, oh, get help or go see a psych or something. And then I thought of all the stories, and I've never been, right? So I thought of all the people I know that have been to psychs and all the other stories and memes and culture about psychiatrists. And I kind of realized that I've never heard a person say, oh, my psychiatrist really helped me. And I kind of had this realization, like, do psychiatrists actually even work? I mean, obviously they work, but do they accomplish their work? And I found this one clip from like 2006 where they're doing street interviews outside this, I guess, psychological college or practice. And they're asking people who had been practitioners for, 10 plus years, saying, so in your 10 plus years, how many patients have you cured? And they all laugh and say, 1. Maybe none. It's like and another says it's an ongoing process, and I don't know. The whole thing is kind of a sham. Anyway, I'm going to go read some more. Yeah, so this is the opening part. On January 11th, the Violence Center became part of Governor Ronald Reagan's formal message on the state of the state. This center, Reagan had said, will explore all types of violent behavior, which causes it, how it can be detected, prevented, controlled, and treated. And yeah, so it was set up, such a Nike missile base is located in the Santa Monica Mountains, within a half-hour's drive of the Neuropsychiatric Institute. It is accessible, but relatively remote. The site is securely fenced and includes various buildings and improvements, making it suitable for prompt occupancy. West had secured tentative approval for a grant of $750,000 from the U.S. Law Enforcement Assistance Administration through the California Council on Criminal Justice, and for another $250,000 from other sources. He was also hopeful that other funds would be provided by the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, which, like LEAA, had become increasingly interested in developing effective technologies of behavior control. It also turned out that in the early 60s, when he was at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. West himself had conducted LSD experiments funded by the CIA, but he apparently did not know the source of his funds, which is MKUltra. Oh, it also talks about Jose M.R. Delgado, who became very famous when he had an experiment where he attached an electrode to a bull's outer horn, and which he was able to send a remote electrical charge that stopped the bull in its tracks. And this was kind of a major news story of the time. And essentially, it was the idea that we could control nature. So the charging of a giant bull was completely remote controlled. And so what the bull would actually do, it would stop and turn in the other direction and keep charging and keep going back and forth. And so it became this, at first it was this huge success story. Oh, we can completely control the animal, the brain waves, everything, the actual behavior of this animal. But it kind of evolved, and the kind of reading between the lines is that some doctors were unimpressed because you basically just conditioned the bull to keep going in circles. It didn't actually change its underlying nature that it wanted to charge, or wanted to charge in a specific direction. So their point was that, yeah, that's a temporary measure, but not an actual long-term solution. But still a very interesting experiment all the same. The Violence Center never really managed to get underway, never got the Nike missile site, and never got its funding. The proposal was too ingeniously blatant, and the timing, which seemed so right in the winter of 1973, the season of Nixon's last and greatest triumph, appeared all wrong a few months later. Protests had begun early 1973 among students and faculty on the UCLA campus, among them several members of Jolly West's own staff at the Neuropsychiatric Institute, reached the California legislature, which threatened to investigate and which blocked the state funding. So it didn't actually go through. They said, the decision said, Earl Bryan, Reagan's Secretary of Health and Welfare, represented a callous disregard for public safety. And so this is another famous doctor, Dr. Skinner, who says, my image in some places is of a monster of some kind who wants to pull a string and manipulate people. Nothing could be further from the truth. People are manipulated. I just want to be manipulated more effectively. So that kind of shows you the psychology and the state of reference that these people are coming from. And he says he wants to increase the rate or the style to which it is now possible to manipulate people systematically. So this isn't just a one-off mind control. This is a systematized, widespread government mind control. It's also interesting that they noted there was a sharp increase in the amount of drunk drivers that were arrested because 1971 was the first year they actually had a computer in the police car, which is just crazy to me that there were computers in police cars. I mean, I'm sure they were highly rudimentary, but they were able to have a kind of simple database where they could look up, people's information, which is, I'd love to see what that actually looked like. Oh yeah, and then it also talks about like weird, just like normal corporate psychology of workers that, so apparently if you want to get the maximum amount of output from a worker, let's say you want them to increase their output by 400%, you have this scenario where you do a value identity proposition. And as they give the example of a Dutch immigrant who's an iron ingot loader or something, and the boss comes to him and he says, "Hey, do you consider yourself a high value man?" He's like, "Of course, I am a very high value person." And so you kind of say, well, if you're a high value person, you take what his current pay is and you increase it by 60%. And then you say, okay, if you consider yourself a high value person, then you show up tomorrow at this time, follow this person, listen to all their instructions. And with that kind of methodology, you can increase his pay by 60%, but increase his output by 400%. And that's another just anecdote in, I don't know what you call it, therapeutic or mental manipulation or psychology that is also taking place. So it's not just pure chemicals, it's also just old mental tricks to get people to do certain things. Okay, this one is just, you just read these things and it's just something out of a villain's book, right? Our schools are, in a sense, factories in which the raw products, children, are to be shaped and fashioned into products to meet the various demands of life. The specifications for manufacturing come from the demands of 20th century civilization, and it is the business of the schools to build its pupils according to the specifications laid down. This demands good tools, specialized machinery, continuous measurement of production to see if it is according to specifications, the elimination of waste in manufacture, and a large variety of output. In this cult of efficiency, all sorts of techniques were applied to the process of rationalized selection and control. So again, like school is a production line. Here's a more philosophical quote. The New Jerusalem. If America could turn poverty into affluence, ignorance into enlightenment, and immigrants into citizens, why could it not convert deviance into conformity and illness into health? If the parent was hopeless, perhaps the child could be saved. And if it was too late for hardened criminals, there was still time to intervene with delinquents, incorrigibles, and truants. Since there were no officially recognized social classes, and since national theology professed unlimited opportunity for every person, no matter how low his station, the formal mandate for reform and intervention was theoretically unlimited. It also talks about the future planning or future proofing, the potentiality of what they would call ill behaviors or disorders for social disorders. So it began with, before the delinquent becomes the criminal, do this. Before the juvenile delinquent becomes the full delinquent, do this. Before the overactive boy in school becomes the delinquent, do this. And before the rambunctious boy or whatever becomes the, whatever, it was all this idea that it was predictive planning, that we need to stop the problem or the natural process of anything before it gets to a potentially bad area. It was basically Minority Report, but for the whole developmental cycle of a school child. There was another one where along with homosexuality, there was also another disease, and I can't find the exact, it's like deliquescence or something, but essentially it was a disease that they assigned to slaves who continually tried to escape their captivity, which shows you just like the crazy history behind what you can classify as a mental illness. It's very interesting. Anyway, I think I've gone through quite a few quotes, but I'm going to end off with the ending here, and there's two sections. Invitations to treatment and management. If enough people recognize that social sanitation cannot cleanse the community of crime or deviance or ugliness, let alone pain and misery, and that, in any case, the political price of the effort is increasing control, that there is a chance to confront the ideology in legal and political terms. Slowly, subtly, humanely, science repeals the Constitution. In the long run, its subjects will no longer know or care whether they are being served or controlled, treated or punished, or whether they are volunteers or conscripts. The distinctions will have vanished. And with that, I will end my reading of this very interesting and dystopian book from more than 50 years ago. But anyway, that is Mind Control by Peter Schrack. A fun little read, I guess, that I've been going through and on and off, and just wanted to share that with you guys. Anyway, I don't know. That's pretty much it. I think I've said everything I need to say, and I don't really usually cover books like these because, the science gets updated, the situation changes, but it is interesting to have it as a snippet in time. And honestly, there are some points in the book where his prose and his writing style is actually rather poetic and kind of fun, and it's very rare in factual pseudo-biographical books like this for that to occur. So I appreciate it for that. But, you know, these are kind of a very common style of book. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. I'll see you later, and as always, keep reading. Bye.